has to press a key to spawn animals. That makes no sense. The animals should spawn automatically every couple of seconds. Also, when the food collides with an animal, it flies through it like a magical laser beam. That's no good either. When the food hits an animal, they should both be removed from the scene. So by the end of this lesson, animals will spawn automatically every couple of seconds, and when the food collides with an animal, both objects will disappear. To make animals spawn automatically, we'll need to create a brand new method called spawnRandomAnimal and put our instantiate call in it. You may not realize it, but this is a very exciting moment because this is the first time we'll be writing a new method. We've overridden methods like update and start, we've called methods like translate and instantiate, but we've never actually written one before. It's a big day. Mark it in your calendars. So to make all that happen, I'll see you in Unity. A whole bunch of different animals by pressing S. But if we want our game to spawn all of these animals automatically, we're going to actually have to write our very first custom function. Now, in our spawn manager class, we're going to write our own function, very similar to the functions that you already see here, start and update. Now, start and update are actually functions that come from the monoBehavior class. Up until now, we've never actually written our own functions to be able to do things that we need them to do. So we're going to do that now. What we're going to do is we're going to type in void. Now, void tells the computer that this function or method does not return anything. So it just does what we tell it to do inside of this block of code, very similar to what the update function is doing in this block of code. So it's just going to do something that we need it to do. Now, when we're creating our own custom functions, we should name it in a way that it tells us the task that it's doing. So in this case, we're actually going to create a custom function that tells us to spawn a random animal. And then to close it off, very similar to our update or start functions, we'll just use parentheses. And then if we press enter and use the curly braces, now we can add whatever blocks of code that we need inside of this spawn random animal function that we've created. In fact, we've already written code that will allow us to spawn a random animal. You can see inside of our if statement that we already wrote all of the code that we need to spawn a random animal. So what we can actually do is just take out this entire 4 lines of code and just put it into our spawn random animal method. So if we highlight all of those lines, and then we Control or Command X to cut it, and then in our spawn random animal function, we can just paste that. that in there. And now, every time we call the spawn random animal function, it will automatically go through these 3 lines of code to be able to create a new animal at the end of it. If we go into our if statement, we can now just type in spawn random animal. And now every time we press S inside of one specific method, great. So we've added our new custom function to our spawn manager. So when I play the game, when I'm pressing S, the animals still spawn randomly, which is great. Now, what we need to be able to do is spawn the animals on a timer, so that way we don't have to press S anymore. Now, we're going to use a new method this time called invoke repeating, and we'll actually put it inside of our start method. And so, what invoke repeating does is it will actually take a method that we want to call, and at a certain time, we'll start to call that method, and then we'll constantly repeat it over time depending on whatever rate we want to use. So in our case, we can actually just use strings, so we'll call the string, and it'll just be the name of the method we're using, so spawn random animal. Now, we need to give it a time to start at, so we'll just say 2 for now. And then we actually need the time that it'll repeat every single time. So we'll just say 1.5 seconds that it'll repeat. So the way that we read this method is that we'll repeatedly call our spawn random animal method starting at 2 seconds. So I'm going to use a new method this time called invoke repeating, and we'll actually put it inside of our start method. And so, what invoke repeating does is it will actually take a method that we want to call, and at a certain time, we'll start to call that method, and then we'll constantly repeat it over time depending on whatever rate we want to use. So in our case, we can actually just use strings, so we'll call the string S anymore. Now, we're going to use a new method this time called invoke repeating, and we'll actually put it inside of our start method. And so, what invoke repeating does is it will actually take a method that we want to call, and at a certain time, we'll start to call that method, and then we'll constantly repeat it over time depending on whatever rate we want to use. So in our case, we can actually just use strings, so we'll call the string, and it'll just be the name of the method we're using, so spawn random animal. Now, we need to give it a time to start at, so we'll just say 2 for now. And then we actually need the time that it'll repeat every single time. So we'll just say 1.5 seconds that it'll repeat. So the way that we read this method is that we'll repeatedly call our spawn random animal method starting at 2 seconds, and then we'll call it again every 1.5 seconds. In fact, now that we have this, we can actually just get rid of this input that we have by pressing S to spawn a random animal. Now, if we save and we go back into Unity, when we play our game, let's hope that this works. There you go. You can see that we have started spawning animals, and every 1.5 seconds, we're going to have a different random animal spawning, which is perfect. That's exactly what we wanted to happen. So we'll stop playing for now. Now, one thing that I do want to show really quick is in invoke repeating, if we type spawn random animal and say we accidentally used a lowercase letter, like our lowercase s, and then we save this, and then in Unity, if we tried to do that again, so you can see at the bottom, Unity is actually saying that it's trying to invoke a method that can't be called, because actually that method doesn't exist. So it's always important to make sure that you properly capitalize things whenever you're typing. So now what you're going to do is you're going to use this fancy new method called invoke repeating, and we're going to use that to call our spawn random animal method. Make sure it's a string, so you use those double quotes. So back in our spawn manager script, we're going to just fix the S on spawn random animal. And we don't like having just these numbers in our code, so we're going to turn these into variables too, in case we want to change the numbers at some point. So we'll call this private float start delay. That way we know how long to wait until we start spawning animals. And I think 2 is a good number for now. So we'll make another private float, since we know this has decimals. And this will be the interval that our animals spawn, so spawn interval. And I think 1.5 was fine, so we'll keep that for now. And then we'll change the 2 to start delay. And then the 1.5f to spawn interval. And then make sure that you close those statements. So what you're going to do is you're going to create 2 new variables for our start delay and our spawn interval. And then you're going to use this fancy new method called invoke repeating to call our spawn random animal method with our start delay and our spawn interval. And then you're going to remove all of the spawn code that we had in our update method, since we'll just be using invoke repeating. Now it's your turn. Okay, so we have it so that our spawn manager is spawning all of these animals in random locations. You can see them as they run down the screen. Now, the problem is that we can't feed any of these animals any of this food that we're throwing. What we need to do is we actually need to have them detect collisions whenever this piece of food runs into these animals. And we're going to use something that should be a little bit familiar called colliders. So what we're going to do first is we're actually going to double click on one of our animals. And so now you actually see that we're in our prefab preview mode. So we can actually just see our prefab instead of seeing our actual scene. And this is where we can actually make changes. So if we made a change to this prefab and say we had 50 of these dough already on screen. And so now you actually see that we're in our prefab preview mode. So we can actually just see our prefab instead of seeing our actual scene. And this is where we can actually make changes. So if we made a change to this prefab and say we had 50 of these dough already on screen, it would automatically apply all of those updates instead of us having to go to the overrides and then apply all in the top right. So what we're going to do is with our animal prefab, we're going to go to add component. And we're going to type in collider. Now you can see we have all of these different collider options. In our case, a box collider is probably good enough for what we need. Just be careful, especially to not select box collider 2D. That's specifically for 2D games, and even though this is top down, we still have 3D objects, so we should be using a normal box collider. Now, the cool thing about using our prefabs preview mode is that we can actually autosave whenever we change things. So we added this collider and it automatically saved our prefab. So that's cool. So we're going to use these perspective views to just get a better angle on our dough over here. So let's give it a side view. We'll just line this up really quick. Now we can edit our box collider and dough already on screen. It would automatically apply all of those updates instead of us having to go to the overrides and then apply all. Okay, so we have it so that our spawn manager is spawning all of these animals in random locations. You can see them as they run down the screen. Now the problem is that we can't feed any of these animals any of this food that we're throwing. What we need to do is we actually need to have them detect collisions whenever this piece of food runs into these animals. And we're going to use something that should be a little bit familiar called colliders. So what we're going to do first is we're actually our prefab preview mode. So we can, if we made a change to this prefab and say we had 50 of these dough already on screen, it would automatically apply. Go to box views of our here if I wanted to, because this collider will actually be a trigger for when our piece of food hits one of the animals. Another thing to make sure is maybe you accidentally click on the dough as you're editing. All you have to do is go back to the very top animal at the top of the hierarchy, and it will highlight your animal, and you can see that your box collider is already applied there. So we've added to do just assets, then I can trigger to go into our pizza. And in this case, I'll actually just go directly into the prefab. If we type in rigid body, ground, if we want our piece of food to fly through the air, we're just going to turn off animals because something if we actually look at our dough now, if I wanted, and since they're already has a box collider, and it'll, you can see it's pretty close. Honestly, it's good enough. It's good as it's gonna. Guys here, either by grabbing the number or just changing the number itself, or we can use this edit collider button, which is super useful. All right, so on all of our animals, we have added each of these box colliders that have triggers on them. We've done the same thing with the piece of food, as well as added a rigid body to it. Now we're going to create a new script so that we can destroy any of these objects whenever they collide using code. So we're going to go down to our projects window, in our scripts folder, create a new script, and we'll just call this detect collisions. Now we're going to add the detect collisions script to all of our animals and our food. And then just make sure to apply those scripts if you didn't do it on your prefabs. So now that we have all of our detect collision scripts attached to all of our different objects, we're going to open up the script by double clicking. Now in our script, what we're actually going to do is instead of using start or update, we're going to go underneath start and update. And we're going to type in void. But instead of creating our own function, we're actually going to override a function that already exists in the monoBehavior class. So we know that start and update are both functions from that class, and we can actually use functions from that class to be able to do things that we want it to do. So if we type in capital O, N for on, capital T, R, I. So you can see here that my autocomplete tells me to use on trigger enter. So I'm just going to press enter on that. And so it'll automatically fill my on trigger enter method. You can see when it auto-completed that it already made this method private so that it's only available within this class. And then it also automatically gave us a parameter that we have to fill in whenever it happens. Now, because of the way that this method is set up, it actually is already pulling all of that information in from monoBehavior. So what happens is in Unity, whenever one of the colliders collides with one another, it'll actually know from this script that they've collided and it should do something. So in onTriggerEnter, we're going to type in destroy. And we're going to destroy this game object. Something we're very familiar with now. So if we save and then we test. So if we watch this food and this fox over here, you can see that the fox immediately eats the food, which is great. Now in our IDE, when our food collided with the animal, it destroyed itself. And in fact, it also knows that it collided with that other animal. So in fact, we can destroy other, which in this case will be the animal that it collides with. And then we'll destroy that game object. So now when we test again, when we're in Unity and we play our game, when the food and the animal collide, they're both removed from the game as well. And then we can actually see if these collisions work. Yep, there you go. So it works on the dough. And one more. Cool. So now what you're going to do is you're going to create your own detect collision script. All right, cool. So we have all of the end our game if any of the animals get past the player. So we're going to add a small thing to fix that just to show us that the game is over. So one thing that we're going to do for cleanup, since we know that the spawn manager can spawn all these animals now, the player can spawn their own food, and all of the collisions are set up, we can actually just remove all of these different food and animals that we were using just as placeholders while we edited them. So we'll select all of them, right-click, and just delete. So in order to tell us that the game is over, we're actually going to go into our destroy out of bounds script. So in our destroy out of bounds script, you can see that we have a destroy object whenever the piece of food goes past the top. And in our else if, we actually have a really nice place where since the animals get past the player, that's a good place where we can end the game. So the way that we're going to tell ourselves that we can end the game is by using something called debug.log. And in debug.log, we can actually just put in a string. So we'll just type in game over. And if we save that, so what debug.log will do is actually in Unity, it will tell us at the bottom where it logs all of the different errors or warnings in Unity. Whenever an animal gets past us on the screen and they get destroyed, it'll tell us game over. So if we just wait for an animal to go by, there goes that moose, and in the bottom left you can see it pops up game over. So debug.log is a really great way to be able to tell yourself something whenever you want something to happen in Unity. So for example, for collisions, if we wanted to know that a collision happened, we could use debug.log to see if it actually happened in case we needed it to. It's very helpful if you end up having some really crazy this all the way next, code a lot more readable. So what you're going to do, go into